support to households and businesses in Northern Ireland. As a matter of opinion, say aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order. We're going to move on now from Northern Ireland to Ethiopia. Quite a leap. So if colleagues leaving us could do so quietly, that would be great. And our main protagonists are all here, and as soon as the Minister is in his place, you're welcome. Order. Order. Rosie Duffield to move the motion. Rosie.
Thank you, Mr. Streeter, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. This debate has come at a very significant time for the Ethiopian people, as it's 2 weeks today since an agreement was struck and signed in South Africa between the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. The ceasefire officially ending this brutal 2-year conflict is of course welcomed by all members of this House. However, according to Ghent University, an estimated 600,000 people have lost their lives. Some 875,000 people have become refugees, and 90% of Tigray's population are now dependent on food aid. These are staggering figures, and of course information is still being gathered. Establishing the full facts is incredibly difficult. This is partly because of the serious danger to even well-established and world-renowned NGOs, whose first priority has to be to protect their workers and those they must give emergency aid to. While we sit in this warm, relatively calm and peaceful place, hundreds of incredibly courageous and dedicated aid workers will put their own safety and comfort aside in order to help the human victims and survivors of the atrocities of war. We may never know the names of those who prioritise the safety and survival of others, but their selfless humanity cannot and should not be underestimated or go unrecognised by this House. And politicians the world over... Sorry, I've lost my place now. Politicians the world over. While it was of course a great relief to hear the news of a cessation of this bloody conflict, just 2 weeks before it, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, had expressed his deep concern that the situation in Ethiopia was spiralling out of control. But there continues to be reports of conflict in northern Ethiopia, including looting in Adwa, drone attacks, and gravely concerning are reports that despite the ceasefire, Eritrean troops continue to defy this and are still active. We know they did not take part formally in the peace agreement, of course. So while there are no assurances of an internationally recognised and supervised ceasefire monitoring mechanism, this continues to contribute to fears about the safety and security of civilians, particularly in Tigray. This conflict has been one of the world's deadliest. So making sure that peace is maintained and agreements adhered to has to be a humanitarian priority for governments the world over. And what I would like to hear today from our government is what actions they are taking to help ensure this, either through direct interventions with the Ethiopian government and or through the UN. I've touched on the famine, the death and displacement of Ethiopia's people, but perhaps the most difficult aspect to discuss is the sexual violence and the human rights atrocities committed over the course of this conflict. There's been extensive verification of widespread atrocities, including by Amnesty International, the UN councils and commissions on Ethiopia, and the testimonies of many incredibly brave survivors. We as politicians hear such evidence relating to war zones quite frequently, but I've rarely been as shocked and moved as I have after hearing some of these experiences relayed to me. The stories are anonymised, of course, to protect the survivors, like Ada, a 20-year-old from the indigenous Arab minority, who was kept in sexual slavery with 2 other Tigrayan women. She was gang-raped by Ethiopian and Eritrean military commanders for over a month in November 2020. Lily, a 23-year-old from Iraq, was kept in sexual slavery with 6 other Tigrayan women and was repeatedly gang-raped by troops when they were hiding in that area. Both women escaped, but one has now given birth as a result of rape. Hannah, a mother of 2 and suffering from breast cancer, was gang raped in a church after being dragged away from family members. Her breast was cut off by a commander and she was left unconscious after being raped by 8 soldiers. There are many hundreds, if not thousands, of similar stories being collected by incredibly brave and outstanding volunteers like Rita Karsai, who spent 3 months in refugee camps talking with those displaced by this conflict. She has painstakingly taken the testimonies of survivors at great personal risk to herself. Some of the horrific crimes were carried out on children. The joint UN and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission found that Tigrayan boys were not spared from the weaponised rapes that took place. I'm lucky enough to be in touch with Rita, thanks to the work of former member of this House, Sally Keeble, who herself has continued to raise the plight of the Tigrayan people. Rita could have chosen to simply pursue her path as an engineer in the UK, but she felt compelled to act and to help those left in the country of her birth. Her own family are dispersed, and she's not been able to be in regular contact with them for at least 2 years now. These are the human beings and experiences of people simply caught up in brutal, bloody and deadly conflicts that have absolutely nothing to do with them. These are the circumstances that lead to displacement, the creation of hellish refugee camps, and many risking their lives to get to safety by any means. If those who signed that peace agreement truly welcome peace, they must recognise and allow bodies such as the UN to carry out their work. If they truly welcome peace, aid agencies and aid itself in the form of food, medical treatment, must be allowed through and to carry out their work unhindered. If they truly welcome peace, this process should be seen to go smoothly by politicians and the displaced diaspora, and a rebuilding of those lives so devastated can begin. We in the UK must listen to the joint UN and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and play our part to help all those affected. And finally, Mr. Streeter, we have to act as a global community and seek every assurance that the peace and cessation of violence in Tigray will be meaningful, real and lasting. Thank you.
Very much indeed. The question is that this House has considered the conflict in Ethiopia. Colleagues, wind up to begin at 5:10. We have, therefore, about 30 minutes, and I think there are 6 of you seeking to catch my eye, so that's about 5 minutes each. So let's be disciplined voluntarily. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Sir Gary. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. It's also a pleasure to see my right honourable friend back in the government, because I know that he, like I, greatly values the effect which British aid has had over very many years and wants it to continue, and indeed so do I, and I know he takes a deep interest in these subjects. As indeed was my honourable friend who was here a minute ago. Oh, he's moved. Up here, the honourable member for Rochford and Southend East, and it's really good to see him in this debate. Mr Chairman, we've held a number of these debates on Ethiopia, and I've had an urgent question. I've taken part in all these debates. I've also chaired the all-party parliamentary group on Ethiopia for probably, I don't know, a dozen years or so, and continue to take a deep interest in the country. And I'm very, very sorry to see what has been happening over the last few years. I was at the Ethiopian embassy 2 weeks ago when the ceasefire, or the ceasefire had been announced the night before, and it was really a very moving moment. There was a lot of hope. And I'm very hopeful that we can now make progress. I think the Honourable Lady from Canterbury has set out the case for the peace, and she's spoken so movingly, and I congratulate her on holding this debate. Ethiopia, the tragedy of the debate, of the conflict, is of course that Ethiopia has held together for so very long, in spite of having a very sizable Christian population and a very sizable Muslim population, in spite of having something like 80 tribes and 80 languages or thereabouts. It has held together. Yes, Eritrea broke away many years ago, but it has been a very peaceful country. It's had great economic success as well, with growth rates that we in the West would probably envy. And sorry, I thought the chairman was pointing at me. It's had growth rates which we in the West would envy, and it has been very peaceful. It's one of the safest countries to walk around as an individual. So that is really the tragedy of it. And it is very important that, and I've called constantly for the UN and the African Union to take more of an interest than they appear to have been doing. But I say that, I think there's been a good deal of success recently from the work carried out by the African Union. And what we need now is to make sure that that follows through, that the peace holds. And that is both sides, and indeed Eritrea, are accountable for this. They have to make sure that the peace holds for the very reasons that the Honourable Lady gives. We have to make sure that food gets through to Tigray. We have to make sure the medical supplies get through. We have to make sure everything that is needed in that part of Ethiopia gets through. When I was at the embassy, I did speak, and I sort of do this slightly reluctantly, but I think it's very important that the West are not seen to lecture developing countries, because we have had our own problems. We have seen 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland. We saw what that did to morale in Northern Ireland. We saw that did in destroying futures. We saw that what it did in terms of the 3,000 or so lives that it took. And we saw the effect that that had on the economy in Northern Ireland. I think at the height of the Troubles, the worst of the Troubles, there was something like a 25% unemployment rate in Northern Ireland. Now that's what war and conflict does to a country. And I did say on that occasion in the embassy that since then, where we have relative peace in Northern Ireland, we have relative prosperity. Yes, there are problems, yes, as we heard in the debate just a few minutes ago, but it's a far better place. It's almost unrecognisable from the place it was, and that is because the conflict was ended. And so I know that that is the wish of the Honourable Lady, who very ably introduced this debate. I know that is the wish of so many, everybody, I'm sure, in this committee today. And it's certainly my wish, and my call goes out to everybody involved to embrace peace and enjoy the benefits of peace.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Sir Gary, and I will stick to your view of 5 minutes so we can all get into this debate. And first of all, I congratulate the member for Canterbury on getting the debate and the way she introduced it, in particular, drawing attention to the way in which women were treated during the conflict in Tigray, the abominable abuse that they suffered and probably sadly continue to suffer from, and the lack of closure of that particular part of the conflict. There are just a number of points. Yes, of course.
Cessation of hostilities agreement is obviously very good news. For there to be lasting peace, however, it's crucial. Victims and survivors have justice. Yes. So does the honourable member agree accountability for war crimes and serious human rights abuses is paramount?
Absolutely, and I'm sure everyone would agree with the member on that point, and I certainly would. And what I was going to say further on in my speech, but I'll say it now, is that we must ensure that the UN Human Rights Council does have unfettered access to all parts of Ethiopia to examine these abuses and these crimes that have gone on, because in the past they've been barred from access and had to interview victims by telephone and things like that, which obviously is a very unsatisfactory way of reporting. The other point I make generally concerning Ethiopia is that there are almost 1 million refugees in Ethiopia from most of the neighbouring countries, South Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, and so on. And it has a massive demand placed on Ethiopia to deal with that. And I would hope that when the Minister comes to reply, he's able to give us some indication of what support we're able to give to ensure that the refugees are decently treated, and obviously where they want to and where it's possible, assistance in returning to the country they come from. The Tigray conflict ended because of the intervention of South Africa, and we should be very grateful for that, and with the support of the African Union. And that was good that it brought about the ceasefire and brought about the agreement. But a ceasefire and an agreement are one thing. It's the progress that happens after that. It is the investigation of the crimes that have gone on. It's the importance of getting humanitarian aid, medical aid and food rapidly into Tigray and not being blockaded or blocked from going in. But it's also the question of their democratic point of view. They could not take part in the Ethiopian elections last year. The government in Tigray has been dissolved, and there is no regional government in Tigray. It's done from Addis. Surely there is therefore a big democratic deficit in Tigray, and if that democratic deficit isn't addressed, that could well be the source of future stress and future conflict. And the last point I want to make is this, that it's not the only part of Ethiopia where there are problems. The Roma community is also facing tensions and stresses. There has been unrest, and there has been violence, and there have been deaths as a result of it. Now, it's not for us to interfere in the running of another country. I'm absolutely clear about that. But we have to be prepared to recognise that we may be able to play a role that can help here through facilitating the UNHRC coming through, but also with necessary aid and support of a humanitarian kind, and also ensuring that not only do we not supply arms that can fuel this conflict to any actor on this particular field, but make sure arms that we sell somewhere else don't also end up in Ethiopia. Because the terror that has happened, the deaths that have happened, and the real problems the people of Ethiopia face, the drought, the famine, the poverty, the lack of medical aid and other issues are ones that really have to be addressed as quickly as possible. Ethiopia was the one country that was never colonized by the Europeans. I see it as the major beacon of Africa, a centre of the African Union and so much else. Let's respect that history, respect that participation, and give all the support we can, and what we hope is a path to long-term peace in that country.
Kate Osama.
Calling me to speak. So Gary, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I would like to thank my honourable friend, the member for Canterbury, for securing this very important debate and for setting the scene, as horrific as it is, but it's so important that we never forget. It goes without saying, the suffering caused by the conflict in Ethiopia is truly heartbreaking. I have constituents with family in Tigray who have not seen or heard from any of their family members in the last 2 years due to the communication blackout. They don't know whether their families are alive or dead. Indeed, due to the stories they have heard about the conditions in Tigray, their assumption is that some of their family members will have almost certainly passed away. Hundreds of thousands of people have died in the conflict. More than 3 million people are internally displaced, and 13 million need food aid in northern Ethiopia. Yet, there is a sense that this humanitarian crisis is not being treated with the utmost urgency. According to Norwegian Refugee Council, the crisis in Ethiopia is one of the 10 most neglected displacement crises in the world, all of which are in Africa. Last week, I and other members of the International Development Committee were lucky enough to be joined by experts on the Horn of Africa hunger crisis. We were told that the conflict in Tigray is intersecting with a series of other factors to create a devastating food crisis. High inflation on world markets, partly as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, is pushing up price of food and fertilizers. The climate change is increasing the prevalence of droughts, the COVID pandemic devastating economies and livelihoods. We were told that there is the real possibility of famine and that the World Food Programme has not managed to get aid into Tigray since August the 24th of this year. We must welcome the recent agreement to allow full access to food and aid, but we must track the implementation very closely. There is no time to waste, with almost a third of children already suffering from malnutrition. Michael Dunford, who is the Regional Director of the World Food Programme across the Horn of Africa, also said at the evidence session that the cuts to the overseas aid budget are harming their ability to respond to people's needs. He said that in 2019, the World Food Programme benefited from 181 million of funding from the UK government. In 2022, they have received less than a third of that so far, which is 55 million. The government is failing to do all that is possible to provide humanitarian support and to help create the conditions for lasting peace and prosperity for the people of Ethiopia. Therefore, I would like to make Just 3 recommendations to the Minister. First, we must restore our commitment to spending of 0.7% of GDP on overseas development assistance if we want to retain the capacity to adequately respond to crisis. Secondly, a significant amount of funding must be immediately directed to bilateral aid for Ethiopia. And thirdly, we need to restore our previous contributions to multilateral agencies such as the World Food Programme. In closing, Sir Gary, we also received evidence from Mamadou Diane Baldi. He is the UNHCR representative in Ethiopia. And he told the committee last week we need greater investment in medium to long-term programmes to ensure resilience to climate change, which would include irrigation schemes and drought-resistant crops. So in closing, I hope the Minister, in his place where he should be, rightfully is, will listen to all of us and will be able to help not only those of us in the chamber today, but also the families who are worried sick, not knowing whether their families are alive or dead. Thank you.
Thank you. And before the next 2 speakers are called, it's my error, but I counted 6 instead of 5. You can, in fact, have 6 minutes each for the next 2 speakers. So my apologies to, especially to you, Jeremy. No. Jim Shannon, 6 minutes. Sorry.
I was at the end now, so I've got an extra minute. I thank the honourable members for being so generous. This is an issue which I'm particularly interested in. I want to thank the Honourable Lady for Canterbury for setting the scene so very, very well on a subject matter. Some of the evidence and information that the Honourable Lady portrayed in her speech today, I have to say, was hard to listen to. I find those things quite unnerving, but I understand that the Honourable Lady wanted to set the scene. I want to speak as Chair and declare an interest as Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on International Freedom of Religion and Belief. So I have a deep concern and a heart for all those individuals who do not get the opportunity to express themselves from their religious point of views. The situation in Ethiopia is tragic, with thousands dead and many more displaced owing to the conflict, and over 13 million people in the northern region of Tigray in need of food aid and lacking essential services. While ethnic conflict rages on, though freedom of religion or belief remains a sorely disregarded human right. Against the background of political violence and unrest in Ethiopia and Tigray, it should be remembered that it's difficult to differentiate between faith and ethnic or politically related attacks in Tigray. And all too often, the religious dimension is brushed aside because of the close links between ethnicity and religion and their close links to various drivers of the conflict. It is difficult to characterise incidents as based on religious identity solely. I omitted, Mr. Chairman, to welcome the Minister to this place. I'm very pleased to see him there. He's a deep interest in these matters, and I know over the years I've been very optimistic with his response to us today, that he, over the years and his interest in these matters, that he will then be able to respond in a very positive fashion to us when we ask the questions. As such, when some might say that the number of reported incidents based on religion or belief has dropped, I don't believe it has, and the figures and the evidential base seems that that's not the case. This should be understood in the broader context of the conflict, with religion so closely entangled with ethnicity and politics in Tigray. There is no denying that the conflict has had a devastating impact for Christian communities, with many churches destroyed and many Christians killed. The Honourable Lady for Ruther Glen forgive me, I couldn't attend, and I know there's one that you had been at, Mr. Chairman, as well. It was Aid to the Church in Need. They had an event over in the House of Lords. But I was just sitting there, and I got it there, and I just read one story, and it's the Eritrea, the Askham massacre in November 2020, when there was an attack on that church where 1,000 people were worshipping. It might be that more, and I quote, that more were injured and died, but some 750 were killed for sure. I think that illustrates very closely the issue. Eritrean troops stand accused, Honourable Lady, for Canterbury referred to it, a campaign of ethnically motivated cultural cleansing, reporting participating in massacres of Ethiopian Christians, and this is the army and the police and those in authority doing these. So it is, and they refer to and I find it very, very sad to see. And it says here also the aid the Church in Need was told that nuns had been raped as part of the attack in Tigray. So it gives you an idea of the brutality, the violence, the ethnic cleansing, and the things that are happening, and people have to be accountable. Ethiopia ranks number 38 on the World Doors watch list for the world's worst places to be a Christian, despite Christianity being the majority religion in the country. Honourable gentleman referred to that as well. But when Christianity is the religion favoured by most, it's hard to understand how Christians have been targeted in that country. Converts from Islam to Christianity in Ethiopia, as well as converts to Protestant churches from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, face mistreatment from family, friends, and the wider community. And Islamic extremist attacks against churches are increasingly prevalent. So many Christian converts face pressure to renounce their faith and continue to suffer as a result of political unrest, dire humanitarian conditions, and added environmental pressures as a result of some of the driest conditions since 1981. Last year, the government said its priority is to ensure that Ethiopians, irrespective of ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation, should receive life-saving aid and that humanitarian access to areas affected by conflict and insecurity is restored. Minister, that's my question to you. If that was said by government, and it has been, our government, my government, then I'm going to ask for an update on where we are. And can the Minister confirm that the life-saving aid and the humanitarian access has been delivered? To conclude, Mr. Chairman, this is not the first debate we have in relation to the situation in Ethiopia. I have very much focused my comments and my contribution to this debate on the religious persecution perspective, which I know, Mr. Chairman, you have a deep interest, as many others in this hall that they have as well, because it matters. But the other issues playing a factor in Ethiopia also matter too. So I call upon the SCDO, upon our Minister, upon our government, to fulfil their promises, take the above into consideration when engaging in discussions with Ethiopia. We have a duty in this House, Mr. Chairman, and an opportunity to be a voice for that voiceless, for those people who have nobody to answer them, and today we're doing just that.
Thank you. Helen Hayes.
Thank you very much, Sir Gary. It's a great pleasure to see you in the chair today, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Canterbury, on securing this very important debate. The conflict in Ethiopia, which began 2 years ago in the region of Tigray, has been and continues to be brutal, devastating and destabilising for the wider Horn of Africa. There are reports of thousands of deaths and abductions, of the widespread use of rape and sexual violence in the conflict, and warnings that the scale and systematic nature of the violence and the language that accompanies it may amount to genocide. I want to pay tribute today to brave journalists, including Lucy Casser, who has borne witness to the scale and intensity of the violence, and politicians including Filsan Ahmed, who resigned from the Ethiopian government over their handling of the conflict in Tigray, and both of whom are remarkable young women who have borne very significant personal cost for their work to give voice to people who are suffering under this conflict. For some of my constituents, the conflict in Tigray has meant a total loss of contact with close family members over the past 2 years. I have a constituent whose parents and brother who has Down syndrome are in Tigray. She knows that her aunt was one of the first to be killed in the conflict, but she's not had any word at all from other family members for more than 2 years, resulting in just unbearable worry, anxiety and anguish. The conflict has left 20 million people across Ethiopia in urgent need of food aid, hospitals entirely without medicine, and 2.8 million children without access to school. The scale of the conflict is as appalling as its brutality. 500,000 people dead as a result of fighting and conflict-related factors such as famine, and 100,000 dead just since the fighting resumed in September. Yet for a conflict that is causing such suffering and has the potential to cause such widespread destabilisation, there has been extraordinarily little international outcry or mainstream media coverage of the devastation and insufficient international engagement. The ceasefire that was recently signed is, of course, very welcome, but it is not clear that it is yet having any impact, with further reports of violence today. And that is not entirely surprising, given the absence of the Eritrean authorities from the negotiations, since Eritrean forces are reported to be amongst the main perpetrators of violence in Tigray. The humanitarian need is desperate, as is the need to investigate the crimes that have been committed so far within this conflict, to gather evidence and testimony, and to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. There has been extensive verification of widespread atrocities in Ethiopia, including by Amnesty International, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Council of Human Rights. Their inquiries have found evidence of atrocities that may amount to war crimes, including massacres of civilians and evidence of language indicative of genocide. One extreme feature of this conflict is the widespread use of sexual violence. Conservative estimates of the numbers of women affected are over 26,000, while some estimates are far higher. While all parties to the conflict have been accused of atrocities, the UNHCR's investigation identifies Tigrayan women as having been targeted for particular violence. It also found that the Ethiopians were the only air force in possession of the drones being used in aerial bombardments, including on a refugee camp. The highly respected Dr. Denis Mukwege Foundation released a report in November 2022 which concluded that data suggest that Ethiopian and allied forces committed conflict-related sexual violence on a widespread and systemic basis in order to eliminate and or forcibly displace the ethnic Tigrayan population. The UN Human Rights Council has found the action taken by the Ethiopian legal justice system to be wholly inadequate in terms of numbers of prosecutions and lack of information about prosecutions and convictions. This is a dire situation which demands the attention of the world. So I really welcome the Minister to his place today, and I know that he has such a personal commitment to see peace in Ethiopia. But I want to ask him if he can set out what actions the UK government is taking over atrocity crimes in Ethiopia, both through direct interventions with the Ethiopian government and through the UN. Whether the government will invite to its Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict conference civil society representatives from the Tigrayan and other diaspora communities in the UK affected by conflict-related sexual violence. What actions the UK government is taking to progress investigations and to support investigations on the reports of genocide in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. And finally, what actions the UK government is taking to help to secure the humanitarian access into Tigray to meet the very urgent need of the population there. My constituents and all those whose families are affected by this terrible conflict need to know that the UK government is doing everything possible to work for peace, justice and humanitarian access.
Thank you very much. We now turn to our front bench speeches, and if I might suggest 7 minutes, perhaps, rather than 5 minutes for each of the first two, and then the Minister can take the rest. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Sir Gary. Having spent as long as I did in the European Parliament, where 90 seconds was a long speech, I'm well used to brevity. I would thank you for calling me, Sir Gary. It's good to see you in your place, and I'd also congratulate the member for Canterbury for bringing this important issue forward to us. Now, I'm glad, obviously, that we all welcome the ceasefire and the peace agreement in Tigray, and brokered by the Africa Union. This has been a real achievement for the South Africans. I think we should give them their place in this as well. This was in danger of becoming a frozen conflict before their involvement, and African diplomacy has gone a long way to resolve this. So I think with our Minister in his place, we should look towards the future and what we can do to help the people of the region to enjoy the durability of the peace. So I'd focus on the durability of the agreement that we've seen struck, the accountability for crimes, as we've heard, and the justice for their victims, and the food insecurity, which I'm deeply concerned is actually going to set the conditions for a relapse into further violence in the region. So in the durability of the agreement, this was hard won, and even as the ceasefire was being announced, one side referred to the terrorist TPLF, I'm quoting there, the other side referred to the fascist clique in terms of the signatories to the agreement. Eritrea obviously not a formal part to it, but clearly involved. So we've not seen any disarmament thus far under Article 6 of the agreement. So what assessment has the UK government made of the prospects for disarmament on the ground, and particularly in terms of how is the verification of the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces going to be checked on the ground? We've already heard concerns about access of international observers. What sort of access are we going to be pushing for to verify that particularly Article 6 of the agreement is being implemented? On accountability, I think we're all united that, for me especially, accountability for war crimes is integral to a just peace going forward. I think that's something that we really are in a position to assist with. But it concerns me deeply that no side to the conflict has accepted any war crimes were committed by their side. And I'm not sure the conditions for accountability and honesty are necessarily there yet. And I can see why accountability would not be foreseen within a ceasefire agreement, but surely the international community can't lose sight of the need for accountability mechanisms. And again, I'd ask what the UK government's doing to assist those accountability mechanisms. The African Union is doing a great deal of work on this, as is the UN authorities, but they have been hindered in their access. And I think that's something that can be usefully taken forward by the UK government to ensure that access, but also to financially support, even in terms of lending personnel to the investigators, as these war crimes need to be held to account and need to be properly explored. But on food insecurity, and it's a wider point than just Tigray or Ethiopia or the Horn of Africa, but on food insecurity in this region particularly, the numbers really are very stark. According to the World Food Programme, there's 13 million people across northern Ethiopia alone at real danger of food insecurity. That's 5.4 million people in Tigray, 7 million in Amhara, 1.2 million in Afar. There are millions of people in real danger of starvation right now. And aid wasn't able to get through, but now it is. And that's one of the big advantages of this ceasefire, I think, that aid can actually get through. But the Food and Agriculture Organization has classified Ethiopia as a whole at its highest alert level for hunger and starvation. So I think this is a real challenge to the international community. It's a challenge, also an opportunity for the UK government to really step up. And now that aid can get through, I think all of us need to consider how we can best help to prevent the conditions for a relapse into violence occurring. So the Minister well knows the SNP's position on the return to the 0.7% aid criteria. He has his own well-documented thoughts on that, and I appreciate collective responsibility today. But surely in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa's case, there is a real need for more aid than we've seen. And as well as reinstating the 0.7% aid, even if we're short of that, I would make a plea today, and I'd be very glad to hear it, for increased UK government aid, particularly to combat food insecurity in this region. Because otherwise I fear that the conditions exist for the bad guys to come back. I think this is a fragile peace. The agreement is significant, of course it is, but it needs help, and I think all of us are united in that effort. Thank you, Sir Gary.
I'm very grateful, Sir Gary. It's a real pleasure to serve under you as chair. And I'm grateful, very grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Canterbury, for securing this debate and opening it so brilliantly. I'd also like to thank everybody else for their contributions today. I think it's been an excellent debate. The devastating conflict in Ethiopia has lasted for 2 very long years. As my honourable friend stated, some estimates suggest that as many as 500,000 people have died, including hundreds of thousands of civilians. The ceasefire agreement simply could not come quick enough, and Labour is deeply grateful to the diplomats who have worked to secure it. And most of all, that means the African Union and their representatives. Because I think we need to face the reality that the chaos in the Conservative Party over the recent months has weakened the UK's international voice. But now we need to look forward. And I hope the new minister will tell us how the government will deepen the UK's support for African Union mediation, peacekeeping and peace-building work over the coming years. East Africa was named as a priority region by this government in their integrated review. We need to understand now how that commitment will be implemented to support peace, security, inclusion and accountability. The first priority, as we know, must be to support humanitarian access for the people of Tigray. In August, 89% of the population in Tigray were assessed as food insecure, and 29% of children under 5 and half the pregnant women and breastfeeding women were malnourished. It's inevitable that this situation has worsened further since then. Over the past 2 years, many people have been descending into deeper desperation in the absence of aid.
Surely this in itself has fueled the conflict, because if the only way you can eat and survive is by signing up to fight, why wouldn't you do that? And this desperation puts women and children at massively increased risk of abuse and exploitation. So what progress has been made with humanitarian access right now to all parts of Tigray? Because let's face it, demand for assistance is extremely high in many parts of Ethiopia and across the region because of the terrible drought. So are we confident that aid agencies have enough resources to take full advantage to deliver life-saving help quickly? The Minister has rightly said to my written questions that the UK stands ready to support the peace process. That's fabulous. So now I'd be grateful to understand how. Can he tell us if discussions are ongoing with the government of Ethiopia and the African Union? And like my honourable friends, I have several constituents who have been agonisingly out of contact with their families in Tigray for many, many months now. Surely we can expect a rapid and final end to communications blackout and the restoration of services.
Giving way. Like her, I have constituents from Tigray, from Oromia and from Ethiopia as a whole, and they're going through the most awful stress, lack of communication, and they want to send help and aid and support. And does she think we could do a bit more to try to facilitate both information to give the families some sense of security about what's happening to their relatives, but also the community in this country is very keen to send whatever help they can?
My honourable friend has known me long enough to know that I agree entirely with what he has just said. As my other honourable friends have highlighted, there have been many credible reports of repeated war crimes and potential crimes against humanity. It is surely unacceptable that the UN-mandated Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia have been so heavily restricted in its work. Despite those restrictions, the Commission has set out damning evidence of horrifying abuses by all parties to the conflict. Because of the lack of access for journalists and human rights defenders, the violations we know about may well only be the tip of the iceberg. So it would be good to know how we are preparing for the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict conference in just 2 weeks' time. Because there have been so many reports of women, children and men being subject to horrific sexual violence, including repeated rape and torture. Many seem to have been targeted based on their identity, using sexual violence as a weapon of war. So I'm hoping that the Minister will be able to tell us how the UK is working to support survivors through access to specialist services, including mental and physical health support and access to justice. Many of the survivors who have been displaced will not be currently safe to return to their homes, and many are in camps in Sudan as well as across Ethiopia. And I'm sure we will all understand that specialist support needs to get to them where they are now and quickly. But I genuinely struggle to see how the enormous divisions in Ethiopia will mend without proper accountability. And this is about security as well as justice for the victims. I'm struggling to understand how we can have confidence in a sustainable peace if there isn't healing and inclusion in Ethiopia. So I'm hoping the Minister will tell us more about the approach he will take to support credible accountability for the countless victims of abuses in this war. And I want to ask the Minister about some of the potential pitfalls, because it would be devastating to the people of Ethiopia and damaging to UK interests if this agreement fails. So first, the agreement excludes Eritrea, and it isn't clear how the rapid withdrawal of all Eritrean forces will be ensured. The government has failed to mirror previous US sanctions against Eritrean entities involved in the conflict. So I'm hoping the Minister will consider that as a lever that he might have to deploy. Next, we know that there are significant border disputes, particularly around Western Tigray. Many of the systematic alleged abuses, including ethnic cleansing, relate to this area. So a pathway will need to resolve these disputes fairly and peacefully. The ceasefire does not end the need for close and consistent engagement from the UK. Far from it. Let's be clear. The UK has much to gain from a just peace. Ethiopia has made an enormous contribution to sustainable development and to the Pan-African vision and its institution. The peoples of Ethiopia the potential of the people of Ethiopia is even greater than their history. And I believe that our partnership and collaboration can be much stronger if the UK supports the peace to hold and if justice is done and seen to be done for the peoples of that very great country.
Thank you very much. Just before I call the Minister, can I just check whether, Rosie, whether you want to take advantage of winding up at the end? We'll give them time to the Minister. It's a pleasure to call the Minister. Andrew Mitchell.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Gary. This is the first time I've had the privilege of performing under your eagle eye. It is my third time in government since I first joined the government in 1992, but I've never taken a debate in Westminster Hall before, so I hope you will treat me gently on this occasion, as I am a bit of a debutante. So Gary, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for Canterbury for securing this debate. I thought that she led off and framed the debate with humanity, wisdom and knowledge, and the whole House will be grateful to her for doing that. I'm also grateful to other honourable and right honourable members for their contributions, and I will try to respond to as many points raised as I can, and I will come directly to the important points that were raised at the end of my remarks if I do not cover them in the speech that I'm about to deliver. After 2 years of brutal, bloody conflict, today's debate takes place at a moment of hope. There is finally a path towards peace and prosperity, Sir Gary, for the people of Ethiopia. During 2 years of fighting in the north, thousands have been killed. There have been human rights violations and abuses on an appalling scale, as has been set out today during this debate. And some 13 million people have been left in need of humanitarian aid. It has been, Sir Gary, one of the world's most destructive conflicts. The peace agreement signed on the 2nd of November by the Ethiopian government and the Tigray People's Liberation Front is an opportunity to bring a permanent end to this conflict. I want to recognise both parties for taking this step towards peace. And I particularly commend the role of the African Union and its envoy, former Nigerian President Obasanjo, who led mediation efforts with support from South Africa and Kenya. This weekend, there was some further cause for optimism. On Saturday in Nairobi, senior military commanders from both sides signed a further agreement that maps out implementation of the peace process. At the forefront of this agreement is a rapid return to full and unhindered humanitarian access to Tigray, which members of the House have made clear today is absolutely vital. The peace agreement provides for a permanent cessation of hostilities, the disarmament and demobilisation of Tigrayan forces, and restoration of services across Tigray. It also provides for a restoration of the constitutional order and the presence of federal authorities within the region. This is, Sir Gary, a comprehensive agreement which, if implemented in full, can serve as the basis for a lasting peace. But its implementation is far from certain. It will require sustained and magnanimous and restrained leadership on all sides and support from Ethiopia's friends across the international community. The UK government has offered its support to the Ethiopian government and the African Union. The early signs so far are promising. Since the 2nd of November, we believe fighting has largely ceased, and the agreement signed on the 12th of November demonstrates commitment to implementation. Now, if I turn to humanitarian access, this is clearly needed desperately. The UN estimates that 13 million people in northern Ethiopia require assistance. This includes millions in Tigray, who humanitarian agencies have been unable to reach since August. Humanitarian access has been one of our chief concerns throughout the conflict. I know that it's a concern shared by many in this chamber. The UK government has consistently called for humanitarian agencies to have unhindered and unfettered access to northern Ethiopia. My predecessor as Minister for Development, the Right Honourable Member for Chelmsford, raised this when she met Ethiopia's Deputy Prime Minister Demeke on the 22nd of September at the UN General Assembly. And she followed this up with a visit to Ethiopia on the 19th of October, where she again held talks with the Deputy Prime Minister. In both meetings, our message was clear: stop fighting, start talking, and ensure that all those affected by the conflict can access humanitarian aid and essential services. We therefore welcome the commitment of the Ethiopian government and TPLF to enable humanitarian aid into Tigray and to restore essential services. It is crucial this agreement rapidly makes a difference on the ground. Now, I turn now, Tigray, to the issue of drought. The conflict has taken place in the context of a wider humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia. In the south and east of the country, there has been an unprecedented 4 consecutive seasons of failed rains. This has led to a devastating drought. The previous Minister for Development visited a region in Ethiopia impacted by drought in October and witnessed one of the largest and most severe humanitarian crises in the world. As many as 24 million people have been affected in Ethiopia alone. In the last 18 months, the UK government has allocated nearly 90 million to support communities in Tigray, Afar, Amhara, Oromia and Somali regions of Ethiopia who have all been affected by conflict and by drought. I turn now, to the issue of human rights, which has been raised by a number during this debate. The peace agreement also affirms the principle of respect for fundamental human rights. It commits to the creation of a comprehensive national transitional justice policy aimed at delivering truth, accountability, redress, reconciliation, and healing. Throughout the conflict, there have been appalling records of human rights abuses and violations. The civilian populations of Tigray, Amhara, and Afar have endured the most terrible suffering. Throughout the conflict, the UK has consistently called for an end to human rights abuses and violations and for accountability for those found to have perpetrated them. We have raised this frequently with all parties to the conflict, through our embassies in Ethiopia and Eritrea, through my predecessor's engagement with Ethiopian ministers, and at the Human Rights Council. The UK was a co-sponsor of the resolution of the Human Rights Council that established the International Commission of Human Rights Experts in Ethiopia. And we are also providing direct funding to support the important work of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Yes, I will, of course.
Thank the Minister for giving way and for the contribution he's making. Is he confident that there will be unfettered access given to all parts of Ethiopia to the UN and to other agencies as well?
Well, I can tell the Right Honourable Gentleman I'm not confident, but we are pressing in every way we possibly can, and we must move forward optimistically. And I will come to the specific point he's raised in a moment when I address some of the comments that have been made during this debate. Yes, I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I look very, very much forward to his response. Minister, I did make the comment in my contribution about the religious issue and the attacks, and I know you come back to that, but I also want to press you, if I can, please, on the issue of the aid, the humanitarian aid and access for those Christian groups that are in Tigray and Ethiopia, which aren't getting the access to aid that they should. Please.
I will, if I may, come back to his comments a little later. The presence and conduct of Eritrean forces in Tigray, Tigray, has fueled the conflict and made its resolution more challenging. The Eritrean government was not a party to the peace agreement, but will inevitably be crucial to its success. We have consistently called upon Eritrea to withdraw its troops from Tigray. I repeat that call today and urge the Eritrean government to support this peace agreement. We recognise that a durable peace in the Horn of Africa depends upon mutually acceptable security arrangements, which must include Eritrea, and we encourage those in the region to find solutions through dialogue. Now, turning, Sir Gary, to development assistance, I want to make a couple of points. First of all, before the conflict, our development partnership with Ethiopia, one of the best in the world, had lifted millions of people out of poverty. Indeed, the results achieved in Ethiopia from British taxpayers' money spent there were truly stunning. And it had helped Ethiopia become one of the world's fastest-growing economies. We want Ethiopia to return to more prosperous times. The peace agreement calls upon international partners to support its implementation, to help build infrastructure, and to support economic recovery. The UK will play its part in that. The UK government has already provided 54 trucks to the UN World Food Programme in the region, and we are working with partners to remove the logistical barriers that prevent them from operating at full capacity. If the peace deal holds, Sir Gary, we will encourage international financial institutions to support Ethiopia's recovery. Of course.
So, to my obviously amateur eye or ear, that didn't sound like an awful lot of aid for the numbers of people who are in need of support. I would ask the Minister if he thinks it's enough.
Well, if the Honourable Lady, who knows a great deal about these matters, will just bear with me for a moment, I will come specifically to the issue of money. This may be a moment for optimism. There is an opportunity to end one of the world's most destructive conflicts. But that opportunity must be comprehensive and nurtured by everyone. The prize is a return to peace and prosperity for a nation of over 100 million people, and the UK stands ready to do all we can to assist with that. Now, if I may just comment briefly on a number of points which I have not covered in my remarks, which have been raised specifically during the debate. If I can turn first to my honourable friend from Tewkesbury and thank him very much for what he had to say. He is one of the experts, many years' relationship with Ethiopia and its people, and the House benefits very greatly from his expertise. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the former leader of the Labour Party, he raised a number of important issues. He asked about the delivery of aid into the conflict areas. And I can tell him that yesterday, for the first time, 2 trucks from the ICRC got through to Mekele. That is a very significant breakthrough. Nothing has got through for so long, so I hope this may be a significant breakthrough on which we can build. The Honourable Gentleman for Edmonton, the Honourable Lady for the Honourable I do apologise. The Honourable Lady for Edmonton, who always takes a great interest in international development, asked me specifically about the figures for aid, and she made 3 very interesting recommendations. Just to be very clear about this, I can tell her that in the last 18 months, and others too asked for these figures, the UK has provided nearly £90 million of humanitarian assistance to Ethiopia. Our support has reached people in Tigray, Afar, Amhara, Somalia and Oromia. And last year, UK funding in Ethiopia provided nutritious food for over 200,000 malnourished women and children, provided emergency health supplies for 1 million people, provided clean water to over 200,000 people, and child protection services to over 40,000 children affected by the conflict. In August, the UK provided an additional £6 million to the Ethiopian Humanitarian Fund, and in October, the former Minister for Development, my right honourable friend, announced 14 million of support to assist 150,000 women and children affected by conflict and drought. And these contributions are part of a wider 156 million UK commitment to humanitarian support for crises in East Africa this financial year. So the Honourable Lady will recall that when I had responsibility for these matters at DFID, I was always very keen to demonstrate what the results were that we achieved for this expenditure of British taxpayers' money. So alongside the figure I have given her, I wanted to stress the number of people we are reaching by this sort of aid. If I may then turn to what my honourable friend for Strangford said, he asked particularly about religious freedom. And just to amplify what I said earlier, Sir Gary, at the 51st session of the Human Rights Council, we co-sponsored a resolution to extend the mandate of the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, and we have added 4.5 million to help build the capacity, pounds that is, to help build the capacity of Ethiopia and the Human Rights Commission. Now, this does not directly address his point about religious freedom, but I'm sure he will understand that it goes hand in hand with human rights, and we are very conscious of the importance of the issue which he has raised. If I then turn to the Honourable Lady for Dulwich and West Norwood, who asked particularly about PSVI, I wanted to know that we have invited a range of representatives, including from the civil society groups. She talked also about the role of journalists. We are very conscious of that, and she will know that this government has made a particular point of trying to support press freedom overseas through the work of the Foreign Office. And she asked about whether people would be held to account for what they have done. And I want to stress as strongly as I can that we will do everything we can to ensure that there is no impunity for war crimes and those who have committed human rights abuses. If I can then come to the Honourable...
You may not have done. Order. I'm so sorry. Our time has run out. We could have listened a lot longer to the Minister. The sitting stands adjourned. I'm so sorry. The rules are the rules, Joe.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.